Getting into the topic of totems, first of all, what is a totem and what is its purpose in the African context?
So when we speak of totemism and animism, because basically it's always important to go back from a foundational point as to what actually are we speaking about. So animism is what informs having totems in your bloodline. And what animism is that we look at the natural environment in animals not only as a sort of instinctual being or another sort of being, but we see divinity within animals. So it means that certain lessons are learned from animals. In our African spirituality, our ancestors learned the ethno-medicine ways of healing, which is umuti, ditlari, miriana, to use them by observing animals in their natural environments, because animals don't go to doctors. They self-medicate. It's something that is inherently built into their instincts, much like dogs know that when they're not feeling well, they're having digestive problems, they will chew grass so that they either help get all of that out, or if their bile is full, they will also then palaza, but the palazis, and we as African people palaza, which is purging. So that's an observance where different animals would have different than trees or leaves or shrubs that they would eat in pertinence to how they are structured. Animism has many layers, but it's just to say an understanding of it, an idea of it is basically the observance of nature to innovate, the observance of nature to be able to learn, the observance of nature to be able to know how to live within in coexistence with the environment, because animals are instinctually aligned with the natural rhythms and cycles of nature. In all of the seasons, they know inherently what it is that they need to do. So animism then, when it's then a practice, would then be totemism, where each tribe would have a particular totem that they attributed to. So that idea, when we look at totemism first to introduce it, is that in our royalty, because we understand that we have royal lineages and coming from a communal background as African people, Ubukosi or the monarchy is very important within the structure of the community. It is basically the place that brings together all of the people in the community. So you find that much like now there's the Lion King, where we speak of Simba as the king of the jungle. Also in our African totemism, when you look at it universally all over Africa, is that all kings have an association with the leopard skin and also with the lion skin.
Yeah.
And that's why they'll speak of Ingwenyama, the great lion, and that is also to signify the fact that in nature, when it comes to predators, lions generally are the most dominant. In the same way as a king then must also emulate things, behaviors like a leopard. Leopards are very ingenious. They are very sentient, if we could put it like that, and sentient meaning that their thought processes are very unique. It's not a very instinctual thing. They are able to innovate outside of their spaces. They're able to live in solitude and be with themselves so that they can understand the core as to how they can traverse so many spaces. Because that's another thing about leopards, is leopards can live in a variety of environments, and that's because of the type of character that leopards have. So we see that in animal totemism, firstly within royalty. And when we then go into the Bantu people, Bantu, we come across the understanding that animal totemism informs a lot of not just the royalty, but a lot of the Bantu people in terms of how they recognize divinity. If we went before the colonial interruption and we went into maybe older sort of Bantu clans, we were like your Kalanga people. We understand that most people who are in Africa who are of Bantu descent, who have animal totems in their clan praises or just as a family totem, is a recollection back to the Kalanga people. So animals totems help to identify almost in the same way as how the way you dress in a particular way. When you dress in orange and red and you shave your head, everybody understands that you're a Buddhist monk. So animal totemism in terms of the representation, because the people would then often have something of the animal representative in the way that they even adorned themselves or things that they used, would then also show and would be a signifier as to where do you come from? So animal totemism within the Kalanga people was very important because the Kalanga nation is basically a nation that was very much in touch with nature and the cosmos. So each and every one, firstly, of these surnames or homes, different bloodlines that had animal totems, they were firstly nature conservationists. It was to be able to then say that if we have almost every single of the animals that would be a threat or would be threatened by human existence, if they each then belong and are seen as the same as your father or your mother or your brother, they are kin to you, they're an elder to you, then there would be a certain kind of protection that you'd have. And if you now then stretch this out to all of the animals around the area, then what you'd have is that you'd have nature that would not be interrupted and would be protected because there'd be an understanding of the divinity of those animals. There's no separation between us as humans and the way we see the animals as totems. Totemism within then modern times, because it's very important to not remain in a static sort of space where we'll reminisce about the time of Gwalanga and those great empires. But animal totemism still exists within all of our lineages. We look at it from Mazulu and the Nguni people. You have people that are Barangwenye, and their totem is a crocodile. And within that crocodile, they understand that if they go to a certain particular place in a river and they see a crocodile, it's not an aggressor, but it's actually a manifestation of the divine. It's a message from the source, the creator. It's a message also from their ancestors, passed through their ancestor, which is the crocodile. In the same way as in your Xhosa people that believe in Umajola. Umajola is a snake. When it is understood in Umajola that they'll speak and narrate that in a lot of the experiences when a new child was born, they'll walk in and find the child and the snake Umajola will be there and they will not threaten or harm the child. So that animal totemism also translates into how people then deal and interact with it. You see it also in your Sotho people. Your northern Sotho people, which is many tribes from your Lobedus to your Mapulana to your Pedi people to your Bakhatla. You know, there's quite a large group of northern Sotho people and your southern people, Sotho people that come then from what would be then Lesotho, and your western Sotho speakers, which would be your Tswana people. All of them speak of, in the northern Sotho, it will be like Re'ana Malopo. And Malopo is then for a totem. It signifies a certain animal totem. In the southern Sotho, they will speak about Muluku, which is your animal totem. We go into your Tswana people, they speak around then what would be said to be Ubina Ing. So Babangwe, Babina Nuku, Babina Ing, and these are interchangeable also within the people. So each and every one of your Bantu people, because Bantu Nabo Besutu come also from the super tribe, what could be understood as the Bantu people, they particularly still keep a deep connection within it where every single family has a particular totem. And that totem then informs also where it is that you would go for spiritual connection. As we've spoken about before, if your totem is an eagle, you would then understand that the natural environment where an eagle stays and everything would be inviting to your ancestors, to your spirit, because that's where you found a source of divinity. But also when we then tap into what we speak of as blood magic, which is ancestral connection. In our DNA, the memory, our bodies carry the memories that go from centuries and centuries, and everything carries a vibration. So if you come from a clan that is associated with the eagle and you go to that natural environment, within that space it vibrates things which are familiar to you in your bloodline, and you can find that in your spiritual connection, what it will do is then you'll start to open up in your channels, you'll start to dream, you'll start to have a deeper sense of your ancestors coming forward and introducing themselves to you from that lineage, along with other supported things just based on your totem. So we can basically understand totemism as something that roots us firstly to where we come from, the Kalanga people, Gwalang. Because when we sit and we think about it, we do come from a very sunny place. So Gwalanga, some people understand it as the east where the sun rises, which is true. Gwalanga also would then speak around coming from the eastern side of Africa, whether it's all the way north or going all the way down, because you find that reference to Gwalanga. So depending on the generation that you look at it from, because even with Egypt, Egypt is northeast. Egypt is northeast, and we understand that the Nubians are Bantu people as well. Nabo Bama Kalanga. You go back and you look at your people in Kenya, and they are Gwalanga, because the sun rises there. Yeah. And so the understanding is that in each of those places, because the Bantu people, what is typical about around the Bantu people before the colonial borders and interruption is that they were migratory people. So they moved in the same way as nature cycles, in the same way as you know, and that was firstly to emphasize the fact that they're nature conservationists, in the sense that if you stay on land and you farm on it and you graze on it, after a certain time that soil becomes tired and it doesn't reap the same thing. So the migration was also to be able to revere nature, and also then understanding that we can stay at this place and then we'll migrate to another place. So the movements of the Bantu people and the migration was with the natural communicators that nature would respond to them. If rains were not coming and it had been maybe a drought for a couple of years, they would then be understood that from the divine source, we must now move to another place. And that's why also when you go and you look, it's in many places all over Africa, you find where the Bantu people are, there were always these great kingdoms that were then went and were established there. Because, I mean, we speak around, starting from in the north, in the furthest north, we'll speak about Egypt and Kemet. The Bantu people were there. You go so far as Ethiopia, a country which was never colonized, the furthest in east, it's also Gwalanga, where the Kalanga people come from. And there you'll find that there's a spiritual kingdom where they have the churches that date back, and a lot of us who are seeking spirituality have the understanding that the original Bible may necessarily come from that area. You then go into what would be your Tanzania, Sofala region, Great Zambezi area. You find that there were Bantu people there who were trading with Arabs, trading with Indians, trading with your Chinese people, even before the colonial mission of the Europeans started, where then you'd find around that area of the Great Zambezi kingdoms, like your Great Zimbabwe kingdom, your kingdom of Munomotapa, where the Rosi people and the Kalanga people settled. You go down to South Africa, you will find Mapungubwe, where also your Kalanga people settled, and the Zambezi feeds into there. So the understanding also was that in nature, as much as there's a connection to animal totemisms that are land-based, but there's also necessarily a connection to the waters. So when they migrated as the Bantu people, they always used where the water would then flow, because where there is water, there is life. And so when we then start to go into New Age understandings, that would be then the introduction of understandings of when we say Mzawe is a person that stayed at a particular place and they believed in water divinities and they are water-based people. Yeah. And those would be typically your surnames like your Bakwena people, because if you go historically into all of the people that have the crocodile totem, you'll find that if you go into the Manika people close to the Nyangani Mountains between Zimbabwe and Mozambique, you find your Ntangwenya people who believe that the divinity is a crocodile. So they connect to that. That is their totem. You find in Swaziland, where we have Lubombo, there's the Ngwenya Mountains. The Ngwenya people is where all the kings are buried, even before the Mbosopuza and them came. And it is where there are caves and it's close to the water. You go into then what would be your Bakwena, Bako Murolong and Yotsana people. They are also high kings that live in very rich mineral places, which is then the other introduction of understanding that Mzawe, as much as it's a water divinity, but it's also an indicator of wealth and prosperity, because when you look at where all of these clans are, where there is water, there will be prosperity. Because a lot of the minerals that need to develop are actually forged with water playing an important part in their development. So that's the one understanding also that animal totemism helps us to understand, is where we would then connect with things such as when we speak of Ingosi Emanzawe, in each place there would be, and in the migration there were totems that were intentionally placed at spaces to be where there would be trading capitals as well, because the rivers were used to be able to then travel and to get to all of those places. So those people understood inherently those spaces, where if you look, and we're carrying on how totemism, because it doesn't necessarily also, a totem doesn't necessarily also have to be an animal. It could also be a certain connection to a certain natural elemental force of creation or a natural environment. You have Maswati that are said to be Bomanzini.
Yes.
And when you go into the spiritual journey and the history of the Manzini people, there's a deep connection with, when it comes to Bungoma, with the water-based sort of healing, because their totem is then that of the water. You go into the Nskubeke ngeMaswati, Bomvuleni, Bomnisi. They are rainmakers. Banis Tiba Sabo, which is actually the spring. So the spring is said to, in their royal lineage, in the Mnisis, whoever goes lapayana ebulunga to go into that into the water, that goes in with skuni lesivuthago, which would be a log that's on fire and comes out, is then said to be chosen by the water spirit of their clan, that they will be then the ruler. So even the way in which animal totemism or totemism informs us is that naturally even Bukhosi is not necessarily defined by, because I am a firstborn, I am going to be king. And you find that also similarly in Mapungube. Your people, your Kalanga people of Mapungube did not elect a ruler based on you are firstborn, you come from the firstborn thing, because there was a council of royal elders, and spirit would then inform in their connection to whatever totems it is, and they would interpret from those totems as to who is the one who is supposed to lead our clan to a better existence, to a better future. So animal totemism, animism and totemism is very important when we look at it firstly from that perspective, is that it makes us understand that we as African people naturally understood that there's divinity in nature, and we understood the cycles of nature. So it means things like climate change and the environment are inherently also part of the knowledge systems that are learned from this animism and animal totemism, which is why we would have people that would be able to tell that, okay, there's going to be a cataclysm. And a cataclysm would be like, maybe there's going to be great droughts. So you'd have prophets that would connect to that message and pass it on because of the connection with nature from that level. So it served to order the community, it served to connect them to divinity. That's what our totems actually do, is how we connect then with our divinity outside of just our blood ancestors.
So the Rain Queen Mujaji, right? Once a very powerful matriarch, and we're looking to see the revival of that power when this latest Rain Queen comes of age. Do you see the concept of the Rain Queen to be something that can still retain its power and sacredness in this modern day, with the pollution of modern life that engages with what was once very secluded and highly sacred? I
believe that with the Lobedu people, Bahamujaji being actually a breakaway tribe from the Kalanga people, what the question that you're asking is basically around how some of the sacred practices that connect to divinity in terms of rainmaking, in terms of asking for fertility, and for all of those types of things which benefit us as a collective, that in our modern times, how is it that we can still give them place and we can recognize them? I believe the first thing that's important is that we don't spend enough time actually going into our African history. What we've decided to do is to let a continuation of what is fed to us and what we're exposed to do to still be dictated by a sort of a Western didactical approach. And that means that, you know, in terms of in history, it would be based on somebody's bias. And when we speak about that, it's around there's certain, and it comes also with the hand of religion, and it all goes back to colonialism and the Bantu people, is that in it, what happens in religion, we believe there is a certain chosen people, right? And that those chosen people are ordained by God, and that everybody else is then just, normal, but the same, but not as divine, not an apostle, not a prophet.
Yeah.
So what that does is that it creates a sort of hero and heroine or deification, where we everything then becomes a reverence to the special ones.
Yeah.
So when we look at it from that perspective, that's why you'll find that in African history, intentionally, it's almost as though it's curated amongst all of Africa, that there are these sprinklings, like in Southern Africa, where we'll hear about the glory of the Rain Queen, and that she's the one who makes it rain, and history would speak around the fact that even Zulu people would come to her to ask her to help them to make it rain, etc., etc. So it would make it seem as though the central power of rainmaking only resided with the Rain Queen. In the same way as there's this hero glorification of Shaka Zulu and his story of conquest, as though he's the only great hero that existed in southern Africa. So when we start to go back into looking at our knowledge systems and our histories from then a truly African perspective, what we find is that rainmaking is something that is not unique to Mujaji, much like we've spoken about the Mbaramnisi. And when we look at the rites and rites of passage and the rituals that we've spoken about all over, in what brings the community together is often what is hosted by Bukosi, or the royal house. And Lobo Bukosi is so that there can also be prosperity for the people, because you can't have, you must have people to rule. And otherwise, then there's no king. King is recognized by his community that he rules over. So in that process, when it's done, it always rains during the period of Ingwala. And the Mnisis are a very central to part of those rituals that are done, because Ingwala starts in the beginning of December and it goes into the summer solstice, and it has to do with the connection to the sun, it has to do with the connection to the moon, which are governing principles of basically what informs our weather. So within that, when we also speak around the people that ensure that there's order, there is also they are responsible for collecting the water from 4 different sources that are then brought together in all of the cardinals, which is also representative of bringing together of all different kinds of bodies of water. Those people are called Bemandi.
Okay.
And they are, and that further then goes to say that even within isiSwati, or the Swati people, there is an understanding that there are rainmakers, and rain plays a central sort of a thing. When you go into then what would be your Northern Sotho cosmology, and your Northern Sotho is not just Bapedi, there are many tribes. Your Lobedus are one of your Northern Sotho tribes. I personally am Mupulana. So when we say Mupulana, means a person of rain. So in just what our clan is called, we are rainmakers. That is naturally what we are. When you go into the area that is Mapulaneng, and all of the areas where they stayed, whether it was from the place where the Mkonja Mountains are, which was called Koshakwaneng in our history, you would find that it was a place where there were large bodies of water. Those mountains were very lush because the rain catchment there was very big. You go into even now where Mapulaneng actually is, because there's been a migration from that area to areas such as around White River, where the Mashiles came from, where it was another chieftaincy. Also, White River is famed for all of its rains. That's where a lot of the farms in Bombela or Nelspruit are. You go into then what is your Bushbuck Ridge, Sabi, Graskop area, which is also another place where they settled Pilgrim's Rest. And it's also an area which is famed for its weather, for its misty weather, for its rains. So that connection to Horiri Mapulana is a connection to the fact that we live in environments where we are able to channel and interact with the principles principality of rain. We are basically saying, let it rain, you who make it rain. And that changes the whole narrative in an African person's mind, because we believe that only Mujaji has rain-making abilities. But when you carry on outside of me being Mupulana, all of the chieftaincies, and chieftaincy is a very controversial word, but it's easier, it's relatable. The rulers, because we believe that everyone was a king, Ingosi or Hoshi, but then there was Hoshi Hulu or Ingosi Lekulu, or the supreme ruler, which then even in times would change from each of the Ngosis, where in this generation the high ruler would come from this particular lineage. So you find that all of the Ntingosi or the chiefs were rainmakers as well. Their spiritual gifts was to be able to make it rain in those places. And when you go into the history and you look into all of the chieftaincies that come from your Northern Sotho cosmology, all of the Hosis and Hoshihadis would always, when they speak, say Ribani Shapula, because they make it rain. Rain is what brings about, life, feeds people, in the same way as then it was a teaching that royalty is actually supposed to give more than what it's supposed to take. It's supposed to cleanse. All of the principalities that rain also represents is representative of why in Northern Sotho cosmology the kings would have the ability to make it rain. So the whole process, I believe, for me is that, to answer your question, just to bring it all home, is that we need to start to relook at the way we frame our understanding of what is truly African history, because then it limits or it makes certain groups seem supernatural or unique and only limited to that, which is when we then go into it, while we have in modern times tribalism. And it's all still a colonial inheritance, because that was the whole purpose of the Berlin Conference. It was to balkanize the land, which is basically to take over the land and cut it up into borders. Those borders were not meant to be convenient borders for the African people, but were supposed to cut brother and sister into different, brother and brother into different places, and make them then limited to that space, and then with the engineering that was happening, turn them into foes. And turning people into enemies is that you firstly build that they must then start to say, all right, we are the Lobedu people, and we exclusively, our party trick is that we make it rain. We are Zulu people, and we are a warring nation. And there are all of these tribal stereotypes that exist because of this frame within which we look at our African bloodlines and our connection to the greater tribe, or the great tribe, which is the Bantu people.
So would you say that as nature conservationists, right, that our different totems worked in harmony to preserve nature as a whole?
It would be also a part of a way that we would firstly, in terms of harmony, to answer harmony, it would be a teaching as to why somebody would say that I'm a monkey totem and you are a snake totem. So we don't get along. I don't vibe with your energy. Like, ingati yami na yakho ayishayisani. So, and that you'd find that when we then look at it from our understanding of intergenerational trauma, that historically then those totems would have then had a history where perhaps if you are of a snake totem and a monkey totem, your ancestors had a disagreement or went into conflict, and that conflict then has still remained unhealed or unaddressed. So then you pick it up as an energy, but it's an intergenerational trauma. So the animal totem also helps you to be able to then recognize things such as certain traumatic potential for trauma, even in terms of getting into toxic relationships, because you wouldn't necessarily want to get into animals that don't necessarily have a mutualistic or a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
People in search of their family totems and the purpose within those totems, where do we begin? A lot of us don't even know where to begin to look for that kind of information. We don't know where to start. Where would you advise a modern day African begins the search of their family totems and the purpose within those totems?
I think it's really a simplification, because some people have, usually your Nguni people, it would take the form of somebody their surname would be Dube, which is a zebra. It would be Shongwe, which is, you would have a surname that is then necessarily then an Ndlovu, yakubona Okajeni, that naturally then connects you to saying that in our bloodline we have animal totemism. Others then you can find it in your clan praise or Sithakazelo Sakho Sinanatelo, Sereto, is that you'd go into then the clan praise and you'd often find that in certain clan praises they speak of perhaps an animal. They'll, like I've made an example of Bondlovu, Okajeni, yakubona, they'll speak maybe, or they'll speak of then if it's a natural place or an environment or a tree. Like for example, Boskakane Bang Bomboma. Mboma is a particular kind of tree. And it's associated also in Mboma is also a particular kind of a snake. And so you would then understand from that in your clan praise that, okay, so if I'm Skakane and we say Sing Bomboma, Mboma is a tree, Mboma is a snake. So these are the divinities that we connect to. So that is the easiest way to go about it.
Yeah.
But much like with everything that has to do with African knowledge, when we say that our history is oral, ask. You ask from those that you have immediate access to in your family. And what I've found is a lot of people will say that, okay, Koko, nobody in my lineage, in my direct bloodline knows any of the family history. We grew up Christian, we grew up very westernized, so those things have fallen away. But if you are someone whose surname, like I'm saying, is maybe Dube, and you want to understand, Wusi, where does it come from, the understanding that our totem is zebra? You don't need to hear it from your father or from your Koko. I think it's a very narcissistic way of looking at things, and it's a very lazy approach. Because in African beliefs, you believe that if meaning Wagatube and I meet someone Wagatube, we are kin.
Yes.
So you would then start to seek out that family history from maybe in a rural setting where they said there's maybe the Dube people come from this particular place. Yes. You understand? You'd go to that place. Like for example, Baras Kakani Babuyam Lewezuma comes from, where is it again? Kandla.
Yes.
You understand? So that's where they are settled. So you would go to that place because there, the history, the traditions, the customs would all be there, and all you'd need to do is to ask if you perhaps come from. And it's in all of our bloodlines. You just need to really go back to step out of the city, step out of the modern environments, and step into the rural, because our indigenous knowledge and our practices still remain alive and well in the rural areas. Yeah. The areas that we now in modernity are made to want to move away from and come to the city. But when we move away from them, we move away from our identity and from understanding things such as you're asking around our totems, why it is important, what it informs to us as a people.
That makes sense, because the Dlamini surname is so popular. What is the totem, the Dlamini totem, do you know?
So, Dlamini, the totem is the sun, Emalangin.
Whoa.
That's why even the national song that is sang Gangwani, because like I was saying there, it's not just animism speaks around the animals. Totemism can be an animal, but it can be a natural environment. It can be a star. It can be many things. You understand? So with the Dlaminis, their totem is then the sun. Emalangeni ngobasi lelevenge lakho Dlamini ngose mfo kangwane. And then they go into then Mayemahle malangeni. It's that connection of then giving reverence and praise to then the sun totem, which would also then inform as to part of then the sun totem informs why then when the ritual is done, it's done at the summer equinox when the sun is closest to the earth.
Okay, so I have almost zero understanding of the Malopo spiritual history. Does Malopo refer to a tribe?
No. So I think let me unpack Malopo, and we take it from from a totemism point of view.
Yes.
Because Malopo has to do with, then they say Hori li ana Malopo or libina Malopo, which is you dance. You dance that particular certain animal totem. So it means that when we firstly look at it, much like we've spoken, that your northern Sotho people, your southern Sotho people, your then west Sotho people, which are your Tswanas, would then naturally necessarily have Malopo as part of their spiritual way of connecting to their ancestors is through Malopo, which Malopo is Malombo or Marombo, which is spirit, right? And the spirit is like basically spirit animal. And when you then necessarily then find that someone will say that I am Guni, but then now I have Malopo, it would also then be around Malopo, do not come from necessarily the Sotho groups, but it actually comes from what would be the mother group, which is your Kalanga people. Because you even then have in your Kalanga people those that dance Iwosana, which are rainmakers, etc. So that totemism is something that would then mean that if your ancestor as a Zulu person who has Dube as a surname could be called to then initiate into the Malopo way of healing, because it's around that spirit animal, that totemism, and how you work with it. Malopo is also then around the sort of natural environments, because we will have an animal totem, but also we will connect to a certain place. Like, for example, the Mapulana people will narrate them coming from Shakwaneng, coming from Mululu Mountains, coming from, Nukayantla Mohale or Musitla or the Blader, and all of those places then are a connection to then the natural sort of mysticism, if we could say, around that. That's why you'll often have that they will say that Ngaka or a healer of the Sotho lineage, that you'd have a lot of them that would then initiate themselves, and it would be through their connection to nature, where you'd say Kingaka Chupe or Kingaka Chipi, which means that they are a natural mystic. Essentially, in the Nguni language, it would then to say Guti Mundul Kedla, which is you have an innate connection to plants and plant-based healing. So that's what Malopo also is about. It's a lot around ethno-based plant healing and understanding plants and understanding how it is that they interact with the body in order to be able to heal, and plants which would uniquely be found in certain places. So you'd find that perhaps in Nguni, in Muti, vela to every, whether you're Mswati, Umzulu, or Ini, it would just be like an affectation as to how you pronounce your Nguni language. But you could find then in terms of, for example, in your Malopo people, what some people would call a certain muti would change dependent on Hori, what those people, where those people find it. So there's a lot of descriptive terms, like for example Tabazindi and Utambazimbi, which is a certain kind of muti as well that you find at a certain mountain. Things like that is part of how you also then recognize the uniqueness of those Sotho people, because they are custodians of certain places. There's a deep connection to the natural environment. A lot of the ceremonies also, when they connect to spirit, are not really conducted where in the Nguni lineage you would have Umsamo or Indumba and Isbaya, and Umsamo would be Indlu ya Koko and Isbaya would be Indlu ya Mkulu. When you go into then your Sotho lineages, they connect and they pasha outside. So they can be a Ndumba that is built for you as a practitioner and everything, but where you would connect would be outside. Okay. You would find that oftentimes what would be used also then to connect would be a certain tree that is planted there, a certain sort of elemental force like water that would be used to pasha the badimo, and then certain roots that have been made into a muti, because snuff is also a muti. The plant has many healing properties beyond it just being a form of tobacco. So those would be the things that then distinguish sort of when we start as to how the the Malopo people conceive everything. It's around a natural mysticism, a deep, not to say a deeper connection, but a deeper interaction with the natural environment vis-a-vis as then what would be your Bantu, your Nguni people who are more settlers and herders and cattle herders. So they would build homesteads, and those homesteads, everything would be centered and ordered and structured around the homestead, with Indlu Yakoko being at the center. And it's all in order to organize the community in that way, which is unique to them. So Malopo is in that way also unique, but also similar, because the principles that govern them are, if you go into the depth of it, I mean, whether you have Umsamo or you have Sibatla Badimo, there's a place where you're going to connect to your ancestors. So the underlying baseline is the same, but the expression is different.
So what are the most defining characteristics of the Malopo spiritual practice and the spiritual culture, would you say?
I believe that when we spoke about song and dance informing every sort of African indigenous practice, even then in spirituality, because you can really only answer the question when you look at it from a spiritual lens, is if we look at Malopo as a spiritual sort of expression, which connects you to spirit, connects you to your identity, connects you to your lineage, what would make it unique when it comes to, would be firstly then what it is that is available in terms of access to the in the natural environment. You understand what I mean? Because the Limpopo and, let's say for example, the Eastern Cape, it's not the same kind of environment. You know, what the natural world offers there is different. So it means that the plants would be different, the diets would be different, and that's why you see the unique diets. In the in your northerners, if we put it like that, you'd see there's a lot of the eating of in diet in terms of mopani worms. It's a very big thing for your northern people who are also then into Malopo. Things such as eating certain kinds of grasshoppers, bugs. There's a whole range of things that when you look into your northerners are around even their diet and informs their diet. When you go then into what it is that when they ate meat, a lot of time, because it didn't allow for them to keep as much cattle as what Nguni environments would do, is that they were hunters as well. So they hunted vis-a-vis then Hutsuma, vis-a-vis Nguni people who herded. And yes, they were hunters amongst them, but it wasn't hunting necessarily for sustenance, or it was a different sort of a relationship with hunting, whereas to your Malopo people, hunting was part of the essential thing. So a lot of the meat that they consumed also was game. So there'll be the connection also there with those kinds of things when you move up, which would explain also why they would eat mopani worms and all of these things, because when you're out hunting, you need sustenance. And if you haven't caught any game, you would then rely on what is easily available there in nature. When you then go into Malopo, then as in song and dance, because song and dance, everything is narrated. A lot of our oral culture is actually narrated in song and dance. Is that the way within which typically what would be your Nguni people drum is completely different. And when I say different, it's in the rhythm, it's in the harmonies as to what type of dances that they do. Whereas, so the drumming would inform it, where you'd find the ngoma is central to all of the Bantu people, but how that ngoma is used is different. Whereas a lot of Nguni drumming, when we get into the ancestral space, is like very fast paced, is very, frantic. There's a very like deep call and response thing to it, which is almost like a war cry that would be unique to them. Whereas in Malopo, it's a more sort of a meditative sort of a sound, where there will be a combination of the use of hands, the use of fists to drum, and then that drumming makes a certain kind of a resonance, which is different from the frantic, busy, fast-pacedness, even when it picks up. And so that would be one of the identifiers. In the way also then that the dances are done. The dances that you'll often find of the people that come from Malopo is that they would dance, their ancestors would dance this particular dance that then connects to that animal totem. So the movements and the songs change in accordance to the totem. I mean, a place where if we look at it even outside of just the initiation space is in your Vavenda people, the women, you generally go through an initiation process. And in that initiation process, that ngoma is they dance the domba, which is the snake dance.
Okay.
And when you go into the domba and you go into the snake dance, it's understood by the Vavenda people that in their creation story, it's a serpent or a reptile-like figure, which is why you also will have things such as in Lake Funduzi, there's a giant albino crocodile. That is a mythological mnigatwe manzi, or what would be said to be a Nzunza-like spirit that is there. So the dances then connect also in terms of initiation, because that is something that also then separates a lot of what would be your Malopo people, which would be your Tsonga people, your Venda people, your Northern Sotho people, vis-a-vis then your Nguni people. Is that in your Malopo people, initiation outside of Gutwasa for spiritual reasons is part and parcel of their way of life. So you go engome nikoma, which is in the same as Gubam Goma, which is Ngoma, to initiate. So when boys and girls get at a certain age, they go into various initiation schools, which are called differently linguistically, but they all are around the teaching firstly of, okay, so your responsibilities, they are organized in both the girls and in the boys based on their skills and their natural abilities.
Yes.
So those that can hand to those that can make things. So it's a way of creating a structure also, which is similar, and it mirrors also the animal totemism, because in an ecosystem, there must be balance. So that is further emphasized by the practice of initiation schools for people that come from the Malopo descent, if you could put it like that, or that are adherents to that, is you go through an initiation school when you're about to become married. There's continual rites of passage and initiation schools or dikoma that are continual, where even then for a king, where there's an initiation rite that is done for that. So the idea of ingoma or initiation, which comes with dances and comes with a certain connection to spirituality within the Malopo space, is something that is common from outside of just the modality of bungaka or bunyanga, or that of being sangoma, which is another unique feature around people that come from a lineage where bariba bina or they have Malopo. They're supposed to go through the Malopo type of style of initiation.
So what languages are most common within the Malopo spiritual practice? And is the Malopo spiritual practice exclusive to those cultures that are most common within the practice itself? Like, can anybody twasa Malopo? And I'm asking because there may be people who feel drawn to that practice, to the Malopo spiritual practice, but may not necessarily be born of a culture that typically partakes in that spiritual practice. If I'm not Venda or Pedi, as a Swati girl, if I feel drawn to Malopo spiritual practice naturally, is that something that I can pursue?
So in terms of the languages of the Malopo people, I could say in Limpopo you have your Vavendas, you have your Tsongas, you have then your Northern Sotho speakers, from your Lobedus to your Bakatlas to your Pedis, etc. Because there are many unrecognized clans which have their unique languages within it, but are just grouped together as like Northern Sotho, whereas your Vavenda people will have a sort of a singular identity, but also in your Vavenda people you then have subdivisions such as you'll have your Venda people that come from Rosi descent, you'll have your Venda people that come from Limba descent, which is your black Jews. So even amongst your the Nzonga people, you'll have people that are Barongwa, some that are Valoi, and each of them is and actually were the clans that existed during the time of the great Bantu tribe. So there were clans and then there was the great tribe which everyone identified to. So you'll find that there is no one main language that is spoken because that is the form of initiation that is done in those spaces, is that Hubinua Malopo. And if we would bring it back home, we would say that Malopo is a blood ancestor necessarily, or that if there were people that danced and were healed through Malopo in the next generation, then there would be someone, whether you're of whatever language speaking, but so long as you carry the blood. And then to look into then saying people that come from different clans or tribes that feel drawn to it, is that very few people can actually tell Hori, where do my ancestors come from? So you could find that, for example, when you look at your Botswana people, which also have Malopo Abona, that there's an understanding that your Botswana people were in Congo, but there's also an understanding that your Botswana people also could be found so far up as places like Burkina Faso, where Dakar people would come from. And the one unique thing around that is that your Botswana people have a deep connection with astrology. So when they speak of God, they speak of Ramasedi, the father of light, and they speak of Mengwedi, which is the moon or the mother of the stars. So a lot of the creation is around astrology. So you find that maybe when you come from Congo and the original Bantu clan or sect that was there no longer is there, but yet you have a gift which then needs for you to have a connection to the cosmos. So you'd find that even then, being somebody who is maybe speaks Lingala and can't even speak any South African language and French and English, that you would then be drawn to Malopo, because Malopo also is very much informed around the understanding of the cosmos and the seasons. There's a lot of, in what makes Malopo unique, an understanding that rituals are done based on new moon, based on full moon, based on where the moon is at. It's done on where the sun is during the day, and also done when we then look at it within how then there'll be things like equinoxes and solstices. It informs certain ritual, every single one of the Malopo rituals. So for you, that's how I would explain that you would find yourself coming as far as from Congo and then feeling drawn to Malopo, because they still have the inherent practice that could teach you the knowledge system as to how to indigenously connect to the cosmos, because that is what your gift of healing, that is how it will channel.
In terms of the Bantu people, the understanding that we generally have in Southern Africa of the Bantu people is that the majority of us are descendants of the Bantu tribe. What would you say are the main characteristics that define the Bantu tribe? And what would you say is at the core of their spirituality?
I believe that for an indigenous people globally, what is at the core of spirituality is the understanding that we firstly interpret divinity to come in different ways. So there isn't an understanding that because I believe in Mveling Auntie as being the creator, and with Uma because I come from Ngunise sort of lineage, that there's anything that is different from you coming from let's say a Tonga lineage which believes in Nyamita or Nyami Nyami being the great creator, or being Tswana and believing that the great creator then is Ramasedi and Medina Lady, or then being maybe any sort of being Yoruba and believing in Eledumare, as being the high source, and believing in Orisha. And being Kikuyu and believing that God comes from a certain is a mountain. We understand that in each of our places, how it is that we came to understand or to fathom the higher source would have been unique to what those people at that place needed for it. So when you look at our stories of creation, so stories of creation are central to a Bantu people. It's very, very definitive. So in some people call it creation myths or origin stories as to how it is that we fathom life was created.
Yeah.
For most of us African people, the creation story that we'll be most familiar with is that in the beginning there was darkness and the whole biblical creation story. But that's one of many creation stories that exist globally.
Yeah.
And what you find within the Bantu people is that understanding of the higher power coming in a unique thing, because it's around, when you speak about the indigenous, it's around what is naturally accessible to you. So if you are Tonga and you live close to the Great Zambezi, it would make sense why to you the idea of God would be Nyamita or Nyami Nyami, which is the great river serpent. Because to you, the connection and what feeds you and informs your culture, the way that you are, is being placed around that setting. So each of the creation stories also document then the history of what exists in those natural spaces, because we recognize as a Bantu people that divinity is not necessarily, or the creator energy is not somebody who's sitting somewhere high up. There's divinity in everything.
Yes.
There is in everything that carries a life essence or has carried a life essence. There is divinity within it. So in each of our places, we document the divinity as to how it's interacted with us. If it's coming from a place of great waters, coming from a place of where there's mountains, coming from a place such as Botswana, where there's large open spaces and deserts, where you'd understand that stargazing must be amazing. It's all just how spirit communicated to us, because we also understand that spirit doesn't communicate through one way. So the creation stories then tell you how those particular people, the Bantu people, communicated or connected naturally through the environment to spirituality. So it means that when we came together as a tribe, there would be an exchange. All of these creation myths would then be exchanged and would be understood to be endemic or unique to that area, because the gods do not only live somewhere. It would be said that this is a place of the gods. For example, where we speak about Inzalo Yelanga in Mpumalanga, Inzalo Yelanga is understood as the birthplace of the sun. And the reason it's called the birthplace of the sun is that that is where the first sundial in all of recorded history comes from. It comes from Inzalo Yelanga. So that is where the understanding of that, the movement of the sun actually tells time comes from. It's much older than Stonehenge and all of those other places. And so those are the historical things as to there would then be a creation story and an understanding of things like that. So what makes the Bantu people also unique is that none was lesser or greater. You find that when we maybe use Inzalo Yelanga as a place where we could bring together all of the Bantu people, Inzalo Yelanga is also a place of kings, a place of initiation, where for centuries and centuries and centuries, great kings, even in current modern times, have come from all over Africa to be initiated into kingship at that particular place. Great healers such as Ukufemba went and initiated at Inzalo Yelanga. That's where Watwasa Kona. And he's not the only one. A lot of what would be your prolific healers would then be called to Inzalo Yelanga, because when you understand that it's the oldest calendar, was in the white man calls it Adam's calendar, is that it's the oldest calendar. It tells all the solstices and equinoxes, and because there's been such interruption, you can't even tell as to whether would it go into telling also things such as the planetary movements, etc., because not enough research has been done, and it's also not understood how the coding system of those indigenous people is. It's still a lot of things which are still being discovered around there. But those are part of the unique things, is that in the Bantu people we understood that the sum is greater than all of the parts. So we came together in all of our divinity and we revered certain places. If I came across to you and you told me that, and you were Manika, or you were Ndao, and you told me that these are the Nyangani mountains, these are our sacred mountains where we believe that, higher forms of life live here, that you can't go up. You still, even in current times, if you want to go up to the Nyangani mountains, must go to the villages around there and get the blessing from Ingosi Akona, the paramount chief. And they will firstly want to find out as to, is it a call for you to go up there? And they will also then tell you, Wutsi, when you go up, don't wear things such as red, etc., to be able to guide you also on your journey, because the mountain is not seen just as a mountain. It's understood that there are spirits and higher principalities and powers that live there. So that's the beauty of, I think, and a unique feature of the Bantu people, is that it informed for us to be able to feed from each other and to renew ourselves from how each of our clans were naturally gifted to commune with the divine. So if you needed cosmic energies for healing, you would go to those who are naturally connected to the stars and to those principles, because they understand that if you had an issue around things such as flow and cycles, which have to do with the water energy, you'd go to then people who have a natural divinity with that, which is, even then when we go into then our spiritual practices, it's something that is still alive. Because when we speak about Manzawe are famed for their cleansings through Ukufemba.
Yes.
And that Ukufemba is the narration and the living practice even in now modern times that connects to the fact that Nzawe people find divinity in the water. That is the totem, and they can come from different totems, which is why they will also then speak around why, for example, then you have such great diviners that come from the north in Limpopo. They are also famed for divining, because in Malopo we speak about observing the stars and the cosmos. So divination is also part of what the planetary movements and the sun being at certain places and the moon being at certain cycles informs and has an impact on everything, things such as the retrograde. So that would feed into the gifts of divination. That also happens there, and you would see it in terms of how, when it's spoken around, the divination tool of the Malopo people is that it's centered around codes, mawa. So it's not necessarily using bones that people in Malopo use. It's more like dice, which comes from certain ivory and certain trees. And each of them have a certain kind of a name, much like a star would have. And then from that mawa, it's able, you then interpret what everything is going on. Whereas the bones are symbolic, they are conduits. They have specific sort of meanings to it. But the story then comes from within.
Yes.
From within, because also when you go look at and often it speaks around things that have to do with blood and with lineage and ancestral connection, that has to do with the fact that mostly Amatambo are a thing that is which is common amongst Yonguni people, and they are people who are very centered around the homestead.
Interesting. You mentioned Ukufemba, and I just had a thought about mediums. Mediums are present all around the globe in hundreds of different cultures. And, we have different names for them in different cultures. Would you say, what is the difference between someone who fembas and a medium? Because I feel like essentially they're kind of the same thing. What would you say is the difference between the two?
So I believe that it's a very beautiful question you've just asked, because Malopo is essentially being mediumship as well. Whereas typically within what would be your Bungoma of the Nguni lineage, it is where you go into trance-like states to pass on messages from your ancestors. Yeah. In Malopo, often what happens is that the spirit is then channeled, like through mediumship. You are a medium to spirits, and those spirits can then, when you go into trance, speak through you. And you'd see it also in how even Ukufemba is a form of mediumship, because you channel energies, principalities, all sorts of that. And within the sort of Ndao Femba and the Malopo sort of spirit possession, if you could put it like that, or mediumship, the two actually borrow from each other, where we would say Malopo actually is birthed from a lot of the water Femba Ndawa sort of thing, because it is of that very same lineage. So there's a lot of similarities in terms of how you act as a portal to connect somebody to their ancestors, like your Maofemba, in the same way as when you go into Malopo, your grandmother can come through and pass on certain messages. In the same way as if Ana Malopo and you're doing Malopo, if you have a certain entity that is in your space, that entity will then come through and channel through the person who is in the Malopo state or Lolo Fembago. So that mediumship, if we had to go into it, from what we understand, often a medium is someone that will tell you that, I see your father and this is where they're at, they're happy, they want you to reconcile that.
Or like Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost.
Yes.
Kind of
embody is that for us as African people in our practices, the mediumship is to be able to channel to a whole principalities of energies, of divinities, of entities, of vibrations. So you channel all of those things.
Okay, so from what you're saying, my understanding is that nature conservation was a priority to us as African people before colonialism shifted our priorities, right? So in that sense, would you say that the revival of African spirituality is essentially a call back to nature? And if it is, how can we honor that individually and collectively in this modern day?
I believe that before we get to our blood ancestors, that this was my father, this was my grandmother, the earth is our first ancestor. We all incarnate or come to take up existence in this earth. And with the earth comes then what could be seen as the heavens, the stars, the moon, the sun, that whole cosmos. That is just the how our existence is structured. And then within the earth, what we find then is natural spaces such as in nature, where it's diverse, right? And when we then go into it, we understand that in nature, it's a representation also of the elemental forces of creation. Air, earth, wind, fire, and then spirit, because all of it then informs life as we understand it. So the understanding of the earth being our ancestor, the moon and the stars being our ancestors or being creators to us.
Yes.
Because a lot of how we interpret creation is that we'll attribute the creational power to something which is a tangible thing, whether it is Ramasedi, the sun, the same as in Kemetic, in Kemetic sciences where they speak of Ra as the sun. Yes. So we practically ground our understanding of the divine through that which is in the natural environment. Whether we say God dwells on those mountains, so the mountain actually is godly within itself. So there's that grounding, is that we look at nature as divinity. Yeah. And when you look at something as divine, you wouldn't go there to take. So concepts such as, that are popular now when we speak about green economy, which is very popular around brands that give back more than what they give. That is something that if you look at African sort of arts or crafts or any sort of tools, everything was around using sustainable things that were easily accessed within that environment. So you wouldn't necessarily, unless a thing was a need, have unnecessarily the importing of a tree or wood that was known to be rare and only grows in a certain place. What you would typically find is that place where we would have a tree that perhaps is only found in that place and is sort of rare, that those forests would be said to be protected because they are divine forests. They'd be said to be divine. Much like they say that the sacred, forest of Funduzi, of the Venda people, when you go into there, there's a lot of indigenous plants which you could only find in that place. That whole environment or that ecosystem is so unique. So we understood it also in then conserving the places by making them sacred spaces, where we would say that mountain you only go to go ask for it to rain. And that's how you would protect and make sure that not everybody goes to overexploit. There would be custodians of those spaces who would have gone through certain rites of passage so that they have a deeper understanding. So it means that even on an educational level, there was an education that was done to understand the environment, to understand the ecosystem, to understand the fauna and flora system of that environment that was said to be sacred. Because sacred is also is also conserved. And that's why in all of the places where we come from as African people living in Africa, every one of us has a place where we come back from where it said, you don't go there because there is, they say that, the river snake lives there. It will be at a particular river, or there'll be a mountain where they say people who go up that mountain never come back, but it's all to conserve and to protect that area from too much human traffic and an over harvesting of whatever it is to be there. And the conservation then carries on to be then in the animal totems, like how we've spoken about them. But I think just central to all of how the society was structured, from how they understood God to, how they structured the sacred places, it's really informed around the protection of nature. And in it, it's about taking, like when we speak about green economy, giving back more than what you take.